Hey everybody, it's a big crowd. Thanks for coming out. We're super honored to have you here at Conductor. I'm Jim Sullivan, I'm an engineering manager here at Conductor. We've had many meetups here. I think this is probably the biggest one we've ever had, so very excited. Yeah. So at Conductor, React is a relatively new thing. We've only been using React for about a year now, not even. You know, in that year or less, I think we've learned a lot, and I think we've learned enough that hopefully some of you will take some lessons away from it. Yeah, so as you can see, what I'm talking about tonight is a painless migration from Backbone to React Redux. So a couple of things about this title. First of all, I know not all of you have used Backbone. I don't want this presentation to be completely useless to you. So I've tried to make it more about a painless migration from any legacy framework to Backbone, or to React Redux. Don't migrate to Backbone. I should watch my mouth because this is a big enough crowd that Jeremy astronauts could actually be here. So Backbone's great. We used it for a while. I'll talk about it in a second. The other thing about this title is that it's not entirely honest. We've experienced a mostly painless migration. There's no such thing as a painless migration. Migrations are hard, and migrations are a little bit painful. I suspect some of you in the crowd have experienced some of that pain. You might not have experienced that pain if you do a lot of work here in the greenfield. Greenfield projects, they're great, right? Like they're a lot of fun, you have a lot of control. If you've been in the business long enough, you know that usually engineering doesn't look like this, it looks more like this. Where you have a little bit of a green field, but you have a lot of brown field. And by the way, brown field is apparently an actual term. I just learned that preparing this presentation. You could say, oh, this is a brownfield project, and that means that you have a bunch of legacy architecture that you need to work with. So before I dig into the fun stuff, let me give you a quick history of how we built our brownfield here at Conductor. So we have been writing JavaScript at Conductor since 2009. We've been around for a while. That was when we committed our first line of JavaScript code. And around 2012, which incidentally is around the time that I joined, we had built up a very large and complex JavaScript application. And somewhat terrifyingly, it was homebrew. It was vanilla. And I don't mean that framework called Vanilla.js, which is the most confusing name for a framework ever. I mean, it was literally just plain old simple JavaScript. So if you've been around long enough that you've seen like legacy applications that don't have a framework, you know that the code was disorganized. We were managing a lot of state globally. We had jQuery manipulating DOM elements willy-nilly, and it was pretty ugly. So we realized it's time to choose a framework, right? Around 2012, there were a few options to choose from. Unfortunately, React was not out yet. We felt that Angular, which was gaining popularity at the time, would be a little too kind of opinionated for us. We needed to migrate our existing vanilla code, so Angular would kind of ask us to rewrite our entire application, which we couldn't do. So we went ahead and went with Backbone. And what Backbone gave us, it was object-oriented. We didn't have to do everything globally anymore. That's great. Standard way to do common things like API requests and rendering and re-rendering. And we even later added something called Marionette, which is another framework that is on top of Backbone. And that's gave us some architecture for complicated layouts and messaging between components. And we rode that for 5 years. So in that time, we grew and the business grew and the application grew. So yeah, again, not trash talking Backbone. It worked for a long time. But we did feel like there was still friction as of like last year. And to give you some examples very briefly, in our large application that was mostly Backbone at that point, it was hard to reason about data flow. It was hard to reason about messaging between components. It was hard to reason about where state lived. In Backbone, potentially every view has a model, so who knows where your state lives. It's hard to reason about composing complex components and user interfaces, and that's just a few of the examples. So we knew we wanted to change, and we decided to pick React Redux. I don't think I have to sell React to you guys if you're here, but just to address some of the points that we were, like the pain points in Backbone, the flow of data and communication was much clearer, state management was much cleaner, we could handle state changes predictably, like all the stuff that we were having trouble with Backbone seemed to be much kind of nicer in React and Redux. So we knew that we had to come up with a plan for migrating. And here's what we came up with. Pretty easy. We just need to take all of our front-end engineers, everybody who writes JavaScript code, have them drop everything, stop building anything for our clients until we've completely replaced a few 100,000 lines of code. So yeah, that's what we did. It worked out great. No, I'm kidding. We didn't do that. You can't do that. That's not how migrations work. What we needed was a practical plan, a real plan. And before I get into the specifics of Backbone versus React, I'll take a minute to just talk about how we came up with that plan. And specifically, I'm wondering if anybody has seen this before. Anybody know what that's a picture of? It is not Mardi Gras or spaghetti. It is Strangler vines. I took it from Martin Fowler's blog because he introduced a pattern. Actually, I'm not sure if he was the original introducer of this pattern, but there's this idea of the Strangler application or the Strangler pattern. And the idea is that if you have something old and you want to replace it with something new, you don't dive in and replace everything all at once. You have to, as he said it, gradually create a new system around the edges of the old, letting it grow slowly over several years into the old system is Strangle. Now this usually applies, or at least I've heard it mainly applied, to like back-end applications, usually not applied to a front-end JavaScript application. But we thought it would be applicable, and in fact, I'll briefly go through how this pattern works, and I'll give you an example. Let's say that this kind of cluster of boxes down here is the front end of Amazon.com, right? And each of those letters represents a feature that they provide to their users. Maybe A is browsing items, B is viewing a particular item, and C is checkout, right? And for the sake of this example, let's say that that's all written in Backbone, and they realize, no, we don't want to do Backbone anymore. So maybe a product manager comes along and says, we want to have Prime Video. We want people to be able to watch video in our application. And the devs say, great, we're going to take that opportunity to build a new feature in React. We're going to build, the old stuff can stay the same, the new stuff is new. And then a product manager might say, by the way, we've been looking at the way people browse and search for items on our site, and we want to change that. We want to really rework it, give it a makeover. And the devs say, hey, that's great. That gives us another opportunity to build something in React. Now, instead of A, you have a prime over there in React. And as you can probably reason about this, like, in the long run, all the old things have been rebuilt, all the new things have been built in the new technology, and you get to this point where everything's built in the new technology, and it's utopia, as you can see from like the flying car, and there are people holding hands on a hill. So clearly, a utopian result. It's hard to get to, but that is the idea of the Strangler pattern. So I gave an example of how that could work on the front end, but what I left out was where it gets tricky. And so I'm going to bring up a couple of cases where it gets tricky, and that's where it gets kind of interesting how React and Backbone have to kind of intermingle. Let's say the product manager comes along and says, hey, we want our users to see a fancy new version of some common component. Now, the devs can say, okay, we're going to build that new version of the common component in React, but that new component needs to live on these old screens, potentially, right? Unless we want to rebuild all the screens, and then cascade effect, you're rebuilding your entire application. Conversely, the product manager says, hey, we want this fancy updated screen, but it has some old components in there that we don't really need to rebuild. We like them as they are. And then you're in the same kind of situation where you have either Backbone components living in a React screen or React components living in a Backbone screen. And that is where we found the tricky part is. So just to summarize before I dig into some code, the straightforward part of implementing the Strangler pattern in the UI is having these 100% React pages and having them live in the application next to Backbone pages. Where it gets trickier is where there's hybrids. And what we decided was we need a pattern for wrapping React components in backbone views, so we put them on backbone pages, and wrapping backbone views in React components so we could put them on React Redux pages. So there's going to be some backbone code. I know you don't all know it. That's the backbone logo. You might not know that either. I'll try to explain it as we go along. So interesting thing about wrapping React components in backbone views. If it's a backbone page, we need a backbone style render method. And as you probably know, a React component, when it renders, it is returning React elements to be used in a virtual DOM. Now, a backbone render method actually directly modifies a DOM element. So that kind of schism between those two things is tricky when it comes to, well, how should this React component behave in a backbone page? The other thing about this wrapper is we need it to be easy for people to use it. And that's especially important when it comes to these legacy pages where we want new components, because it's very tempting for any engineer, myself included, to say, oh, you want me to change this thing on a legacy page? I'm just going to use the legacy technology. It's too hard to use the new thing. But then we're not moving forward. So we knew this had to be very easy. We knew this had to be accessible. So what we did was we built a function that basically wraps your component. You give it a React component, it will give you back a backbone view. So you take your React component that you want to use, you pass it into this function, and the return value is a backbone view that you can use just like a backbone view on a backbone screen. So going into it briefly, the initialize method of a backbone view is basically, it's a lifecycle method that is called when you construct a backbone view. And the important thing that we're doing here is we're actually looking at the React component class that was passed in, and we are getting its prop types, and we are extracting those from the options passed into Backbone. And we're basically building, as soon as we construct this item, the initial kind of hash of props. That way, when it comes time to render, we can just call react.dom.render and then create the class with the props and use the L, which this.L is a backbone thing, which means, hey, this is the element that you need to modify. And interestingly about this is react.dom.render, you don't see it often because that's usually what you use to, like, at the very root of your React application. But in this case, this is the way we're getting this on the screen, right? So we're using that kind of liberally here. We also included a new method, which is called update. And the idea here is we want to emulate the sort of React pattern of passing new props down. There's no way to explicitly update those props in the wrapped React component. So what we're actually doing is we're taking that kind of cached hash of props, we're updating it, and then we're going back to render, which actually tears down the React component that's there and rebuilds it. That's a bit destructive, but backbone render methods are actually pretty destructive in general, so we thought that that was kind of an acceptable casualty. And here's an example of using it. If I have a React component that I want to use on my backbone page, I call the function to wrap it, and now what I have is basically I can just make a new backbone class, a new backbone instance, pass it in the element, and it pretty much works just like a backbone application, backbone view rather. So now let's talk about the inverse of that. Let's talk about if you have backbone views and you want to wrap them in a React Redux screen. Now here are some things to consider about these backbone views that are being wrapped. Again, their render methods behave totally differently. They want to render HTML directly to the DOM. Another interesting thing is that these backbone views might be stateful. In modern JavaScript frameworks, you hear a lot about kind of disposable views or views that are not stateful, and that's encouraged in React and Vue and a lot of things. Backbone components that we built in 2012, we weren't thinking about statelessness, so we might need to wrap these components that are actually very stateful, which means we can't reinstantiate them, we can't just throw them away. And finally, these wrapped backbone views may need to affect the shared state. So on a Redux page, that means they may need to dispatch Redux actions. So let's talk about the first one, which is addressing that theme of we have a React component wrapping a backbone view. That backbone view wants to just reach out and touch the DOM directly. So how do we do that? And like I said, we're kind of new to Backbone. So like for me, this is like advanced Backbone. I don't know how many people have, just out of curiosity, how many people have like read the docs about refs in Backbone? Sure. Now, interesting. How many of you have actually used in React? Sorry, how many have actually used refs? Okay, yeah, a few of you. I mean, what's interesting about this page of the documentation is the overarching theme of it is, are you sure you want to use this? So, interestingly though, I feel like we were justified because when to use refs, the third bullet in the list is integrating with third-party DOM libraries. That sounds like what we're doing. So if you haven't used refs, it's kind of neat and again, kind of dangerous, don't use it. When a component renders, you can embed in the JSX this ref attribute, and it's a callback. And after the component mounts, that callback is going to be called with a reference to the node in the UI. And what that allows us to do is we create a new Backbone view, and we give it, and we have to do this when the component has mounted because otherwise it's not there yet. So after the component did mount, which is another lifecycle method in React, we can assign an element to our Backbone view, and we can just render it. And it feels a little dirty, but it does the trick. So now we've got it showing up on the page. The next thing is I want to make sure it stays on the page, because again, these are legacy Backbone components. If we just like blow them away, we could be in trouble. So we're going to use some more lifecycle methods in React. I'm sure everybody's used this one. Should component update. We're gonna say false because we don't actually want to destroy this this DOM element with our Backbone view in it. We don't want to re-render that. And then in terms of updating, right? What we're going to do is we're going to use another lifecycle method, which is component will receive props. And usually for Backbone methods, it looks something like this. We will basically take those new props and apply them to the Backbone model. You can also apply them directly to the Backbone view. This can be kind of customized on a per view basis. The third thing is affecting shared state. So you have a Backbone view in your React page. If it's a button or an input or something, somebody's going to interact with it. You need that interaction to get out of the view. It's not enough for it to be trapped in there. So what we're going to do, this should be no surprise, in terms of like passing down your Redux actions, they come in as props. And what we'll do is we will just listen for a change on the model, which is usually how like that kind of action is represented in Backbone, although you could also listen. This is Backbone events syntax, so .on is a Backbone thing. So we're listening to a change in the model. You could also listen to an event from the Backbone view itself, and then we will just go ahead and call on change with the, in this case, new text from a text area. So that concludes the kind of technical-ish parts. I want to wrap up by just kind of talking about where we are now and what's coming up next. Even though we've only been at this for less than a year, I would say about 80% of our front-end development is happening in React Redux, which is really exciting. And that number is growing quickly. So using that kind of Strangler pattern, using like the kind of adaptation layer between React and Backbone, we were able to really rapidly get to a place where we're using React and Redux a lot. A question that comes to mind is, how do we measure success? So we're shipping React Redux code. I mean, that proves that we changed something. Does it prove that we actually had a win for the organization? And it's not enough to just say, no, we shipped it. We want to consider the effects of this new framework we're using. One effect is quality. Backbone, like I said, because of the kind of friction we had with Backbone, we were experiencing, we didn't have a high degree of quality in our code. We didn't have a high degree of confidence in the quality of our code. So Now that we're using React Redux, I can say that we do feel a higher degree of confidence, and also we actually released a few screens in our application, and some of the most complicated and tricky screens too is where we started, and we haven't actually had any bugs yet on any of them, which is kind of crazy. So I'm feeling pretty good about the quality. The other thing we wanted to improve by introducing React Redux is velocity. Now personally, I think that velocity is hard to measure. If there are any Agile Scrum ideologues out there who want to argue about that with me later, come see me, that's cool. I find it hard to get a really good data-driven perspective on velocity. I think it's more important to just get a sense from the team hey, do you feel like you're moving faster? Do you feel like you're having less friction? Do we feel like we're able to do more now at a higher rate? And anecdotally speaking, we actually have experienced that. Most of our engineers are saying that React Redux let them move faster, give them more confidence about their code, and are just generally less frustrated, which I think is a metric we don't talk about enough, the peace of mind and sanity of engineers. So that's it, actually. That's all I have. I'm happy to take some questions if you guys have any. Yeah.
Doing this migration, did you have to make changes to your routing system? And if you did, how did that go?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One thing I didn't address in this talk was the notion of kind of routing, and I keep saying the word screens, but that could mean a lot of different things. That could mean routes in a single page app. That could mean literally page refreshes. So our application is primarily not a single page app. That's something we would love to change, but we just haven't had time yet. A lot of when a user navigates from screen to screen, they are actually loading a new page. And that is what actually allows us to have zero friction when it comes to a brand new React page versus a totally legacy Backbone page. They could live side by side easily. We have not had a situation yet, because we do have some, it's not a single page app, but we do have some areas that are single page. So you're on a feature and you're doing different things in the feature and there is routing. We have not yet needed to sort of consider, oh, we want to build one of those routes in a different technology. I think, and I wouldn't die on this hill, but I think that what we have built in terms of wrapping React and Redux views in Backbone should allow us to do that. We should be able to kind of use a legacy router to get to a screen that contains a React view, or maybe even vice versa, but we haven't tried it yet.
I'm curious if you spent any time trying to migrate your models into the store, the Backbone models, and what difficulties you might have seen?
Yeah, that's another really good question. Backbone, a big part of Backbone, I've only been talking about the views, and the other side of that is models. And I will say, again, I'm not here to trash talk Backbone, but we found that models were one of the hardest parts of dealing with Backbone. The idea that you have this hierarchy of views, and at all the different levels of this hierarchy, every view can have a model. It becomes a real frustrating experience to try to remember what is where, and you run the risk of having the same data in different places that is kind of not agreeing with itself, and we've seen a lot of bugs from that. So honestly, when we built a few of the old pages again in React and Redux, we didn't even try. We decided to kind of start from scratch, from the data perspective, from the model perspective, and obviously that takes a little more time and effort to kind of build a new model in our heads and in the code of how this data and state looks in a Redux store versus the Backbone models, but I think it's probably the right move. Because again, Backbone models we found them very hard to work with.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody.